Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartia and welcome to TFiR Insights. And today we have with us Peter Zaitsev, co-founder and CEO of Percona. Peter, it's great to have you on the show.
Hello.
From your perspective, how do you look at this decision? There are a lot of things that were answered. There are a lot of things there. It was more or less about whether Google, from the fair use point of view, is able to use those API. They have still not made any decisions about API in general can be copyrighted or not. So talk about, how do you perceive this decision?
I know this is a very good outcome and very good outcome specifically for open source community, right? Because if you think about open source, right, this community at large was not a lot based at their creating its own patent portfolio, right, and so on and so forth. But in many cases, disrupting many industries, right, through their innovation of commoditizing things, right? If you look, for example, at Linux, probably by far the most impacting open source product, at large extent, that was done as open source re-implementation of commercial Linuxes which existed, commercial Unixes which existed before it, right? And that repeated itself in many other industries since that, right? Or many other technologies.
When we do look at APIs can be used, leverage in so many different ways. Some companies they do. I mean, that's how the cloud native world, open source work. Where they release the APIs that people can plug into. Then you can implement them. You can have your own service. You can have your own product. So you can kind of imitate, copy somebody's API versus you can plug into somebody's API. So can you also talk about even when we do look at APIs? What are the challenges here, or especially in the context of this lawsuit, what are the areas which are clear and which are the gray ones?
If you think about the APIs, right, there is a lot of APIs which exist in technology, right? Some of them are what is of course case here is a pretty much like functional APIs, which are kind of defined in the header files and defines how functions are called. There are also things like protocols, which is another kind of API, right, and which are also very important. For example, if you look at Amazon, let's say S3 storage, right, which was copied and implemented by many others, like including Minio in the open source space, right, and which through that became industry standard, right? You have even other things like think about your printers, right? How cartridges fit together out there is also kind of API, right? And we see in this case is what there is a different level of a patent protection and sort of what you can copy and what you cannot. But in general, in my opinion, the more we get permission, right, to commoditize the space, the more there is a value for consumers, right? Even starting with printers. Hey, if I can buy the cartridges from wherever, then I have a choice, and probably I can print my stuff less expensive, right? If I'm speaking about the protocols, again, that is fantastic, right? Now, I think what is interesting in this case is what for many technologies, we have this understood by the industry, and it is already chosen as an either open protocol, right, or something like that, right? In others, it is intentionally restricted, right, by folks to contain monopoly, right? Or in others, it's maybe kind of not intended for a purpose, but it was reverse engineered, right, and applied by folks, right? And in my opinion, I think this is from like an open source hat, right? You always look towards the openness, right? And the protocol, the APIs, they're more open they are, the more alternatives would likely to exist, and as such, the more value would be created in the universe at large.
The way Supreme Court made the decision, do you think it kind of helps not only the open source communities but cloud native world where we do, which is like API driven world, where we are taking a breath of relief that hey, you know what, we don't have to worry about that thing, or there was going to be no impact whatsoever on open source. It was just about Google and Oracle or Android.
Well, I think if you talk about this, going back to the lawsuit, right, we started discussion with, right, I think at large, there have been many companies which are doing some sort of API copying, right, in the industry, and that was a very common way of doing things, right, and that will go kind of interesting in both directions, right. Like for example, after MongoDB went SSPL, right, not open source license, what Amazon did is they essentially copied MongoDB API on a protocol level, right, to build the document DB, right, in this case. On the same side, the Amazon is themselves there because they have been the first successful cloud and the biggest, cloud in US. Their API is often copied. As I mentioned, S3 API in particular is copied by many, right? So that is really how the industry operates those days. What the successful APIs get copied, right? And there is a lot of innovation going on, right? You can also find MySQL API being copied by many, right? Or like protocol re-implemented, or you would say same happening for Postgres, right? There is ScyllaDB, right, which copies Cassandra's protocol, right, and so on and so forth, right? And if a lawsuit would have gone the other way, right, and especially if it would be kind of expanded to not just the header files, but for example for protocol re-implementation, that could suffer very severe consequences, right, to that industry, right? And a funny thing in this case, I think that could have put US in severe disadvantage, because we have to remember, right, what while Supreme Court is maybe the law of land, this is only US land, right? And it doesn't prevent innovation in other countries, right, happening from this way, right? So this is kind of an interesting lawsuit, right? Is as it was result what we got right now, it's kind of non-event. It's kind of maybe your relief, right? It's like maybe going to a doctor and finding out you don't have cancer, right? Well, hey, guess not, right? You can continue living, right, as you lived before, instead of your life now completely changed, right? So that is how I see that.
You mentioned some companies there. What is happening in today's world is also a lot of companies, they are resorting to using licenses as a weapon to solve business problem. Elastic was a very good example, but you should also know that if your product is open source, fork is a critical piece of open source, and that is a strength of open source, that the code, depending on the license, can be very easily forked. So doing so is, I don't know whether it's make even sense, but from your perspective, are you worried about this trend where companies are changing their licenses? Because the way I look at it is that either your project is fully open source or not. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think reality here is this, is what if you look about the companies, often their needs are different in different scale of a company, right? And that's just not in the technology space. For example, we all heard, many of us heard, what Uber would subsidize every ride, right, to essentially get a market dominance, and then they can actually make money. Kind of the same applies to many open source companies, right? Many of them, they start as an open source with permissive licenses, right, and kind of explain, hey, we will be open forever, we love you, community, right? And then as they got enough adoption, then they start having a commercial version, right, or some features which are released only in the cloud, or maybe getting all the license for switching to a proprietary license altogether, right? And that always kind of said like, oh my gosh, we have to do that to be sustainable, right? Well, let's not trick anybody, right? They knew from the outset what they have been embarking that pathway, because you cannot, provide everything for free forever, right? In this case, that's kind of not sustainable, right? And obviously, having everything legally set up correctly, right? They are able to change the licenses, right? But that is not particularly good for their users. In some cases, it's better than others, right? Now, some people ask me in this case about this SSPL change, for example, for MongoDB, which went a few years ago, right, from SSPL to from AGPL to SSPL, right, and Elastic, right? And why are those situations very different? There are two reasons, right? One, if you look at the MongoDB claims, they always, or they're kind of reluctant open source company. Their CEO used to say, what we did not open source MongoDB for help. We did that as a freemium model, right? Their Elastic really was always built on the surge of the giants and by community. Elastic itself is based on Lucene, which is kind of Apache projects, a lot of community, and there is thousands of contributors to Elastic, which have been contributing the code with expectations of being able to use the fruits of their labor, right? Then Elastic says, okay, thank you, but no thank you, right? We will now take this as SSPL, and if you guys want to continue to contribute to our code base, you can do that, but you only will get results of SSPL, which does not work for a lot of users. Because guess who is contributing the most in the open source projects? These are people who make money on those open source projects, right? Which would be for Elastic, many people who have some sort of Elastic-based software as a service solutions, right? And so on and so forth, which were cut by SSPL, right? And that is not surprise why you have Amazon and some other companies support that, came very quickly with a fork of Elasticsearch, which did not happen with MongoDB as example, right? And in this case, you can kind of look at that in this way. Well, Elastic was in their own right to change the license, right? Because that's how the governance of that source code was set up. But at the same time, any member of community, like Amazon in this case, was able to exercise their right to fork in open source and provide their alternative, right, under the old license.
Are you worried about the future of open source? Do you feel that the golden age of open source is over, or you think that, hey, it's a big ocean, these are just some waves, they keep coming in, going, and open source will continue to thrive as it has been for decades?
Yes, well, I think if you look at that, every innovation, right, it starts from this wild west kind of environment, right, which can be a lot of fun and a lot of fast innovation. But then as it grows, then there is a lot of much more complexity emerges, right? If you think about not just about the open source, but think about internet, for example, right? I mean, I remember in the early days of internet, right, it was kind of no regulations, right? No various GDPRs and what's not, right? And there was no this kind of like a monster players which sort of like control everything, right? You can do a very fast innovation in the open field, right? And right now the freedom of the internet, which was kind of expected to bring us, was kind of co-opted, right? And many people now think internet is Google, right? Or internet is a Facebook, right? And that is an unfortunate reality. Now we kind of have this similar situation with the open source, right? When the open source as idea was co-opted by number of companies which have more control, making more money on the open source, right? And they are attempting to redefine what the term means, right? In this case, to leverage that value. And on one extent, that is a danger, right? On the other hand, I think what there is a lot of people who understand the true values of the open source, right? And I think over time, this kind of fake smoke and mirrors, right? It would be unlikely to last, right? I mean, in this case, as me, growing up in the Soviet Union, right? I mean, we have maybe the country who was operating like a long 17 years, right, on smoke and mirrors, right? And at the times, it maybe looked like that will be there forever, but it didn't, right? And that's kind of my kind of take overall, right? It's just we have to keep the long view, right, and have a patience to see through it.
Peter, thank you so much for taking time out to talk about this very complex, complicated, controversial topic, but we focused on tech aspect, and I would love to have you back on the show. So once again, thank you.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Thank you.